Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Sarah Wilson with the Newberry Library. Thank you for joining us for today's program, Macbeth and the Gunpowder Plot of 1605, with Erin Sloan and members of the Shakespeare Project of Chicago. We are grateful to the Newberry Center for Renaissance Studies for co-sponsoring this program. The Newberry is an independent research library in Chicago with collections spanning more than 6 centuries of human history in Europe and the Americas. We have been free and open to the public since 1887. The Newberry is currently closed, but will be reopening its doors to readers and visitors on March 2nd. You can visit our website, newberry.org, to make an appointment to do research in the reading rooms, or you can stop by the library without an appointment Tuesday through Friday afternoons to visit our exhibitions and Rosenberg Bookshop. Following state guidelines for COVID-19 restrictions and for the safety of our community, our public programs remain virtual. Visit newberry.org to learn more about our many digital resources, online classes, and virtual public programs like this one. You can always shop our bookshop selection of wonderful books and unique gifts online as well. And I encourage you to follow the Newberry on social media for more opportunities to engage with our collections, our staff, and stories that bridge the past and the present. Today's program is one example of the Newberry Library's civic commitment to public education and intellectual engagement, bringing together communities of scholars, students, and the public to discuss ideas that matter in our world today is central to the Newberry's mission. During the program, please enter any questions you might have in the Q&A feature on Zoom or in the comments section if you are joining us on Facebook or YouTube. As time permits, at the end of our program, our speakers will respond to your questions. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Peter Garino, who will introduce Erin Sloan and the program. Peter Garino is a founding member of the Shakespeare Project of Chicago and has served as its artistic director since June of 2010. He recently directed News from Gravesend, The Wonderful Year, adapted from the play pamphlets of Thomas Middleton and Thomas Dekker. In April, he will appear in the new film By Help of Devils, which he directed with Helene Augustiniak, in which the Newberry will be screening. Stay tuned for more info, and with that, I will hand things over to Peter. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you're tuning in from. Thank you for joining us today for Macbeth and the Gunpowder Plot of 1605. Before we get to our program, I did want to share with you a little bit more information about our film, By Help of Devils, which will be streaming on the Newberry on April 28th at 4 p.m. So I'm going to share my screen now and have a look at the trailer for By Help of Devils.
Oftentimes, to win us to our harm, the instruments of darkness tell us truths, win us with honest trifles to betray us in deepest consequence.
That's By Help of Devils. It looks at the topic of evil from the perspective of 14 different Shakespeare characters. Once again, April 28th at 4 p.m., streaming through the Newberry. I'd now like to introduce our special presenter today. Erin Sloan is no stranger to the Shakespeare Project of Chicago. She's an actor and director, first appeared with the Shakespeare Project in Women Beware Women in 2019. Her other appearances for the project include Abigail Adams in Jefferson and Adams and Maggie in the Californian Incident. She served as dramaturge on our production of Titus Andronicus and was scheduled to direct our Measure for Measure last May before it became the first show in our 26-year history to be postponed. And we all know why. We have committed that when we are in a position to again produce live performances, that Measure for Measure will be our first show with Erin at the helm. Most recently, Erin taught theater at the College of William and Mary. For For 3 years, she was an affiliated teaching artist with the Shakespeare Theater Company in Washington, D.C. She holds an MFA in classical acting from the Academy for Classical Acting at George Washington University and has a BA in history from the University of Oklahoma. She has several regional theater credits, including Ford's Theater and Taffety Punk Theater, both in Washington, D.C. Erin has also appeared in the Emmy Award-winning electronic Field Trips, which was produced by the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. Please join me in welcoming Erin Sloan.
Thank you very much, Peter. I'm very excited to be here this afternoon. I hope I put together a really great and interesting program that will foster some interesting thought and discussion. What you're going to see today is a series of interviews that I have done over the last few months. Due to time today, we are going to look at the first interview that I did with Dr. Jim Horn of Jamestown Rediscovery in Virginia, and the third interview in the series with Barbara Zahora of the Oak Park Festival Theater. There's a second interview that you'll hear talked about during the program today, and at the end of the program, the panelists will throw that link into the Q&A and the chat for you so that you can actually access that program and watch it at your leisure. So as far as how this all started, I was actually in my first production of Macbeth in 1995. So I have now dated myself for you all. And I was a student at the University of Oklahoma. I am from Oklahoma, and I was there in 1995 during the Murrah bombing. So that kind of influenced my thinking as I took on this first production. It was also the same year that I found a really great book by Gary Wills called Witches and Jesuits, which talked about how the Gunpowder Plot influenced Shakespeare's writing as he was writing and crafting Macbeth. So throughout the course of our interviews, we talk about witchcraft and the plot and all of the subtext that Shakespeare was dealing with as he crafted this play. So again, you're going to see two interviews of the three that I did for this program. They're each about 30 minutes each, so we will go past the 4 o'clock hour, but I encourage you to stay with us. And if you have any questions, please post them in the Q&A and we will answer them as we can. And we will definitely come back after 4 o'clock, and we're happy to speak more to those questions that you might have posted. With that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And we will see you after the first interview.
The Shakespeare Project of Chicago presents The Gunpowder Plot of 1605 and its influence on Shakespeare's Macbeth. In the early hours of November 5th, 1605, Londoners awoke to the news of a plot that had been thwarted. King James I had intercepted a letter that stated, "They should receive a terrible blow at this Parliament, and you should not see who hurt them." A search was made of the great vault beneath Parliament. It was there authorities found great piles of wood and 36 barrels of gunpowder. 8 Jesuit conspirators would be implicated in a plot that, had it succeeded, would have changed the course of Western civilization as we know it. Shakespeare was in the midst of writing Macbeth, and the Gunpowder Plot would influence one of his bloodiest tragedies. Hello and welcome to the Shakespeare Project of Chicago's program, The Gunpowder Plot of 1605 and its Influence on Shakespeare's Macbeth. My name is Erin Sloan, and over the course of the next 50 minutes, we will explore how a plot crafted by Jesuit conspirators to blow up the King of England, along with the largest governing body in the Western Hemisphere, influenced one of the greatest writers in the Western Hemisphere. In this program, we'll talk to a historical expert, an educator, and a theater professional about what makes a gunpowder play, as it was more than just Shakespeare who was commenting on this event in popular 17th century culture. And how do we make this play relevant to modern audiences? But first, a burning question, no pun intended, posed by author Gary Wills in his book Witches and Jesuits. If Macbeth is such a great tragedy, why do modern productions of it so often fail? And what about all the superstitions surrounding the play? As an actor and educator, I've studied the play over many years and was in a production many, many years ago. We were never allowed to say the name of the main character during that production for fear of some kind of supernatural retribution. And I kid you not, the night before we opened, our director fell in a hole after the final dress rehearsal and broke her leg. She showed up to opening night in a wheelchair. But superstition and bodily injuries aside, why has the superstition surrounding this play taken on a life of its own? Perhaps we need some backstory on the events that took place on November 5th, 1605, so that we can get into Shakespeare's headspace as he started to create one of his greatest tragedies. For that, I sat down with Dr. Jim Horn, president of the Jamestown Rediscovery Foundation in Virginia. Dr. Horn is an expert on 17th century English history and the author of several books, including Adapting to a New World, English Society in 17th Century Chesapeake. Let's hear what Dr. Horn has to say about what the atmosphere was like in 17th century England that would lead to the Gunpowder Plot, as well as some interesting pastimes of King James I, and how that helped Shakespeare transport 17th century audiences to, in the words of his contemporary Francis Bacon, another hell above the ground.
So again, Jim, thank you so much for, it's November 5th, right?
Right. A great day for it.
That's right. I know. We'll see what happens today if the will of the
Yes.
people
Yes.
prevails. So I have a few questions for you in regard to the Gunpowder Plot.
Yeah.
And I know here in America, we don't really pay too much attention to November the 5th, but in England, I know that is it still celebrated? I know it's Bonfire Night in England.
Yeah. In fact, I used to live in a place called Lewes, which is in East Sussex. And every year on November the 5th, there's a huge kind of carnival with lots of fireworks, and the Pope, whichever Pope it might be, is burnt.
Oh.
And it's pretty raw. Yeah. I mean, there are parades of people in costumes. There are tar barrels being rolled along the streets. There are various bonfire societies. It's actually a 19th century tradition, but
Okay.
in the 16th century, Lewes was one of the centers of the new Reformed religion, and Mary Tudor, Bloody Mary,
Mm-hmm.
The majority of people outside of London were actually executed in Lewes by burning. So, yeah. So there's a memorial in Lewes to they're called the Lewes Martyrs. So yeah, it's very much a very lively occasion throughout England, actually, as well as in Lewes.
Well, can you talk a little bit about so that was 19th century. Let's go back to the
a few hundred years.
the roots. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what was the atmosphere in England like at the turn of the 17th century that would have led these individuals to conspire this plot against King James?
Yeah, I think got to step back into the 16th century and the Reformation, which pitted Catholics, really broke Europe into two power blocks, Catholic and Protestant. And England was the leader of pretty much the leader of the Protestant group of nations. And for decades, Elizabeth fought against the Catholics,
Mm-hmm.
principally Spain under Philip II, France was also a threat, but was consumed in its own religious wars. So there are a number of religious wars going on throughout Europe in this period, which essentially were part of this Protestant versus Catholic crisis that beset Europe in this period. So that's the background. Now, James I was actually born in 1566, and so he's being brought up in this atmosphere. His mother was a Catholic, of course, Queen Mary, and married to a Catholic. So he's brought up, however, as a Protestant, and he's part of the Scottish Church. And so from his earliest years, there's factionalism, there's fighting between various nobles in Scotland to control the future king. He is the king actually by 1567. He's still, you probably know this, but he's still the longest reigning Scottish king in Scottish history, 57 years, I think it was, through to 1625 when he died. But at any rate, there's all that in the background. There's all this fighting, assassination attempts, and so on. His mother, of course, died in England on the block, Mary, Queen of Scots. So that's an important thing to understand. Is these two big camps of Protestant and Catholics, and the threat that they perceived from one another. But in England, it's really more about the Spanish threat and the fear of popery being reintroduced into England and destroying the Church of England, which is Protestant. So by 1605, when the Gunpowder Plot takes place, there's a great deal of optimism about James because he is a out and out, avowedly Protestant king. So I think many of the Reformed religion, the Puritans in England, those of a rather more enthusiastic temperament than maybe Queen Elizabeth was, hoped for great things from James, that he would assume the mantle of being the leader of the Protestant group and pursue it more vigorously. And this is a factor at the time. And the Catholics were very concerned about England becoming even more avowedly Protestant, which explains the plot. I mean, it's one of a number of popish plots that took place in the late 16th century against Elizabeth. And here we go with the effort to blow up the Houses of Parliament on November the 5th. So that really is the broad background of it all.
And the more that I read about James, he's very interesting. He wrote books and pamphlets, and he had a very big interest in witchcraft and demonology. Yes. Can you talk a little bit about that and how, because that really comes into play within Macbeth in terms of the witches, the weird sisters, and Hecate, and Shakespeare uses that symbolism. So can you talk a little bit about James and his interest, in the occult, as it were?
You're right about James being a scholar, and he did hold his own as a scholar, really, with some of the experts, the intellectuals of the time. And there is this famous episode where he goes to Denmark in late 1589 to get married and bring his bride back to Scotland. And in the spring of 1590, there's a terrible storm as they're coming back over the sea, and one of the ships is lost. The escort ship is lost, and they're nearly lost. And in Denmark, which is of course related to another play, Hamlet, and Elsinore. Yeah. So in Denmark, there's a concern that witchcraft had been used to bring about the storm. But it's really interesting because there's been this alliance between the royal houses of the Stuarts and the Danish. Mm-hmm. So they think of the witchcraft plot as being a joint plot, and a whole number of reputed alleged witches are rounded up in Scotland. And that's really, I think, a number of James I scholars, I'm only going by what I've read here, but a number of James I scholars do think that's where James became particularly worried about witchcraft. And factor in the troubled upbringing he'd had, the factionalism, the infighting, the assassinations. Mm-hmm. One of his mother, well, I think it was his father who was assassinated. So his mother died on the block, his father, Darnley, is assassinated. So who's to say whether witchcraft would be used against him, and he becomes more and more interested in that, writes about it in Demonology, one of the I think the only book written on devil worship in this period by a monarch. Mm-hmm. So yeah, he takes it pretty seriously in Scotland at this time. Not much going on in England in terms of witchcraft, and it's interesting to me that Scotland is kind of seen as rather more marginal. Okay. So it's a place it's a kind of place where it's rather more wild, and mm-hmm. you might get these occurrences of dark corners of the land is the way mm-hmm. Puritans called these areas, that they're rather uncouth, uncivilized, and prone to superstition and in some cases witchcraft.
So would you say once James ascends the English throne, then that influence, is that when we start seeing, the rise of the persecution of the witch in England itself, and then it kind of transfers over to North America?
It's rather the other way on, that there's a big purge of witches in Scotland, but it does pick up in England when he arrives in England, and there's several quite famous cases, but it's really a bit later in England that mm-hmm. the persecutions really develop, and that's associated with the 1640s, Matthew Hopkins and the Witchfinder General, and the mm-hmm. civil wars and the troubled times in England. Witchcraft in England is there, superstition is there, and it's again part of this uncertainty about the direction that the state religion will go in. Will it ever return to Catholicism? In Lancashire, for example, the Pendle witches, which I think is about 1612, a famous case of a group of witches that were discovered, and again in the wilds of Lancashire kind of thing. So but it never really takes off in large numbers until the Civil War period.
Okay,
which is mid 17th century, as you know.
Yeah. Interesting, very interesting. So final question, and this kind of comes, there's a great book by Gary Wills, who is he just retired, a history professor from Northwestern University. And I remember reading this book, not to date myself, but back in 1995, and I found it absolutely fascinating, and it really was my first introduction to the Gunpowder Plot and its influence on this play, and how in the year 1606 there really were a set of gunpowder plays, as it were, Middleton, Dekker,
All right.
The Jacobean
Yeah, yeah.
playwrights of
Yeah,
the
yeah.
era. And he really lays out, you know, what it takes, what qualifies a play of this era as a gunpowder play. And it's typically language. We're talking about the word mine, M-I-N-E, and blow come up
Right.
quite frequently
Right.
within the text. And, you know, basically setting, witches are involved, of course. And this idea that it's they described at the time I've in my readings that the plotters were they had created this hell underground that was going to affect, you know, life on earth. And so Shakespeare really did, with Macbeth, create a hell on earth. You weren't going into subterranean plot. It was the Macbeths had literally brought hell to earth, and it moved amongst us, and they were going to impose it on Scotland. So it really fascinated me, and the fact that we celebrate Guy Fawkes Day. We basically celebrate a horrible event that never occurred.
Yes.
And,
yes.
and so, in my mind, you know, what are modern comparisons to the significance of the Gunpowder Plot if it had succeeded?
Well, I'll step back a bit, because I think that last comment of yours was really interesting, that we celebrate an event that never happened. But of course, the plot happened, and the execution of it didn't, fortunately, as that turns out. But nevertheless, the plot happened, and popery remains one of the strongest influences on English political ideology throughout the entire 17th century. I mean, you think about all the way through, and this is a period, of course, when English people begin migrating to America, to English America. One of them very early is George Percy, who's the son of the Earl of Northumberland, the Wizard Earl, he was called. So again, connections there. He must have known Shakespeare, actually. I'm sure he did. He was put in the Tower, like other good people like Sir Walter Raleigh, by James I. But George Percy ends up going to Virginia, and there's some speculation that he may have known about the plot because his brother was involved, Thomas Percy. So the point being, really, though, that popery is a really strong force in English thinking at this time, and linked to the overthrow of the English states. You think about the Spanish Armada of 1588. Well, that kind of threat hangs over England, Britain, by the time of James I, through from the early 17th century all the way through the 17th century, the civil wars, Charles I, II, James II. So what are the current parallels? I'd certainly say it's rather more 20th century than 21st, but I'd certainly say, for a start, McCarthyism and communism.
Okay.
I mean, very much so.
Yeah.
We don't necessarily bring in the witches, but certainly the fears are there that our way of life will be overthrown by another powerful bloc.
Right.
So the other, probably the most challenging issue that this country faces is racism. And I think not alone in that, but nevertheless, racism, if you see it broadly in terms of perceived threats to a way of life, and the way in which some people are really worried about people of color getting too much power, that white people might not have such influence in the future. The demographics of the country are are changing. So probably the parallels would be communism, and it's sometimes people use the word socialism, which is a very different kettle of fish,
Right.
but nevertheless, throw it all together. And racism, I'd say.
That's very interesting, and especially within this country, if you think about the institutions that have been built with racism, built into it, and then you kind of relate that back to the British monarchy and that institution, and the government is there to serve the people, and if they don't serve them, then
they
plots happen.
The will of the people. But worth bearing in mind, I think, since we're dealing with Macbeth, that there was a lot of prejudice on the part of the English against the Scots. I mean, especially the English aristocracy, they didn't think that the Scottish aristocracy, the Scottish nobility, had two pennies to rub together in this period. So they saw that they certainly welcomed James. There was no effort to resist his coming to England and adopting the English crown. He rather saw himself as the first British monarch, actually, and he wanted to be called King of Britain, but the English wouldn't allow that. But there's a good deal of, I don't know if you could call it racism, but certainly prejudice against Scots. And Macbeth is very much, the Scottish play, right? So, it's an undercurrent, I think, in Macbeth, but it's an important consideration.
Well, and in some of my other readings, there's scholarly thought that Shakespeare actually wrote it to help James with his unification push, and to say, he's part of this line, and this is so that it was almost unification propaganda in some ways.
Yeah, interesting. So, a fantastic play.
Oh, it is, and it's been interesting too. Because I've seen it, I've been in production or two, and I have noticed that like the first half of the play, it cooks and it's just full of action. But when you hit that second half, it really falls short. And a lot of directors are like, you have this really weird scene where Hecate comes in and we just want to cut that. But if you cut that actually has, it's inspired by the plot. And so you have the language and you have the imagery. And again, if you cut that, you're cutting that action. There's the whole scene with Macduff and Malcolm, and it's an equivocation trial, as it were, because they're trying each other's loyalties to see, are you on my side? And so the language is, again, reflects that equivocation, which was, that's how the Jesuits, defended themselves without, offending and lying to God. So,
interesting.
So it's been very interesting to think about owning that second half of the play and honoring the history and the current events that influenced it, as opposed to pushing it to the side and just trying to have a very character-driven vehicle. Because again, the front half is very Mr. and Mrs. Macbeth. But then as soon as the action starts taking over, and in the second half, they're much better together than apart. And in the second half, they're apart. They're basically, they take two different paths. They're better as a unit, and it's brilliant that way. But if you rely on that, character relationship in the first half, again, not paying attention to, the undercurrent that's really driving this story forward, it does fall flat. and then it becomes cursed, and
Yeah.
people are afraid to stage it.
Yes. Be careful what you say.
That's right.
So,
Right.
one other, really a sidebar, but it kind of relates in a way. You may have read that at Jamestown we discovered a small silver box about, I don't know, 4.5 inches long.
Mhm.
Looks like it's silver. It was found in the grave of one of the leaders of the colony, Gabriel Archer, who was the nemesis of Captain John Smith. So it turned out we couldn't figure out what it was. We couldn't get it open. It had corroded shut. Almost looked like a small pin box that one of the women who first arrived in Jamestown might have brought with her, although rather fancy for that, I thought. But it was in fact a Catholic reliquary we discovered. And inside it was packed with bone. Of course, it's only 4 inches long, so that's not necessarily a lot of bone, but clearly a saint's bone because it was human.
Right.
And there was a small little tiny bottle that would have contained holy oil or so. Now, what that means is that there was a Catholic or several Catholics in early Jamestown, the earliest years of Jamestown, and that was the period when the Spanish ambassador in London, because James did have a Spanish ambassador despite the rivalries, he had a Spanish ambassador at the court of St. James. Was there a Spanish plot, Catholic plot going on in early Jamestown to confound the colony? Now, it wasn't something that Shakespeare wrote about. He had other concerns like Bermuda, but the Isle of Devils. But it's kind of another one of those interesting examples of how small things, this tiny silver reliquary, quite unique, nothing has ever been found like that in Europe or America, takes on this broader significance when you think of the international dimension of it. So that, you know, we think of, you and I have talked about the Tempest at Jamestown, performing it at Jamestown, hopefully after the pandemic. That's another issue at the moment, but here we are with Catholics and Protestants in this tiny outpost on the edges of the Anglophone world, not long after the Gunpowder Plot. So just an aside, really, Erin, on that. But,
it's fascinating because it's really
kind of interesting.
Well, it takes it from that macro view all the way down, literally to that micro view, and how it can influence.
Lovely talking to you.
Lovely talking to you as well. Thank you so much. This was wonderful. Your insight is always amazing. And
I grew up with it, not the insight, but the Gunpowder Plot.
All right, so that was our first installment. Again, I would remind you to go ahead if you have any questions to please post them in the Q&A, and Peter and I will do our best after the 4 o'clock hour to answer your questions and address those. In our second interview, we actually talked to an educator at Lake Forest Academy who teaches Macbeth to freshmen in high school. And that's the YouTube link that you're going to find in the chat after the program if you would like to watch that interview again at your leisure. So in our third interview, we'll skip the second one, skip straight to the third. We're going to talk about Macbeth in performance, a little bit about the superstition around it, how to stage it to where it's relevant to 21st century audiences, considering all of the gunpowder context and so forth. So here is our second interview with Barbara Zahora of the Oak Park Festival Theater.
Oh, for a muse of fire that would ascend the brightest heaven of invention. A kingdom for a stage, princes to act, and monarchs to behold the swelling scene. A different play, but this is what it's all about. Right here, this great wooden O. For once you've come to understand what was going on in Shakespeare's mind as he penned Macbeth in 1606, it's up to the actors to bring the piece into this space right here, where performer and audience come together for a brief time to commune with the text. For we as actors are the abstract and brief chronicles of the time, and I can't think of any time more pertinent than right now. But I suppose that's what any actor performing any Shakespeare has realized for over 400 years. We are essential workers, telling the story of the human condition. And in this play, examining where and how demons lock themselves onto man and cause people to behave in reprehensible ways. Or is it demons? Was it just us all along? When students encounter this play for the first time, they are shocked that this is how people would behave. Not so shocking. We show you the possibility and the warning you should take away from it. In our final interview, I'll talk with Barbara Zahora, Artistic Director of the Oak Park Festival Theater. We discuss her 2017 production of Macbeth in Oak Park and how she balanced the 17th century gunpowder subtext within the play and her modern audience. We talk about the job of actor and director to make that communal moment between actor and audience relevant and present. We also touch upon the ever-present and pervasive superstition around the play, but moreover, I think in our conversation, we find a way to free the play so that it can live as the great tragic commentary which Shakespeare intended it to be.
Today, I am very excited to be joined by the lovely Barbara Zahora, the Artistic Director of the Oak Park Festival Theater. And the reason that I have asked Barbara to talk with me today is we've had our interview with Dr. Horn, who was our historical expert. We had a lovely chat with Tyler Madeley, who was our educational expert in regard to teaching the play. But today, I'm very excited because I get to talk to another actor about Macbeth. I mentioned earlier when I was talking with my two previous interviewees that many, many years ago, I was in a production of Macbeth. It was actually one of the first plays that I was cast in out of college. And I played Lady Macduff. And I did
too. Oh, we're Lady Macduff sisters.
We are. So I didn't go on till the second half of the show. So I got to sit backstage for the first half of the show. I ate popcorn. It was great. It was an outdoor theater in Oklahoma. So of course it's the last show of the summer and they dress us in furs and wigs and because it's, you know, only 100 degrees. But they made me pregnant. I was a pregnant Lady Macduff.
They did that with me too.
And then I had my my young son, who this kid had the best name ever. His name was Alden Olberding.
That's a brilliant name.
I know, little Alden. And I was still in school at University of Oklahoma, and I would drive up to my hometown, do the show, and then drive back down to campus. I forget my mom and came to see the show. My mom was teaching at the time, and she called me a couple of weeks into production, and she says, "Yes, my teacher friends came to see the show, and they had some questions about your marital status." I was like, "I'm a senior in college. What's the deal?" Her teacher friends actually thought that I was really pregnant.
So it must have been a good.
I was like, yes.
A good little bump. Yeah.
Do
nice.
This acting thing. That's right. That's right. But yes, I remember right before opening night, our final dress rehearsal, our director fell in a hole and broke her leg and came to opening night in a wheelchair. And the cast was like, "Oh, the curse has followed us."
Oh, wow.
And like you would get in really big trouble if you said the name of the play, and you would there was like the spitting and the turning around of the things. And So can we talk a little bit, since we're actors?
Yes.
What are you, from a performer's perspective, what are your thoughts on the superstitions surrounding the play?
And I mean, it's interesting for me, I guess, because I, as you know, we were talking about before, I have a very long relationship with this play. I guess a lot of us do. Like you, I was in college when I was playing Lady Macbeth in the play, and in a very bad production. It was, you know, I feel like it was very poorly conceived. It was done by one of the professors who didn't do a lot of Shakespeare, so I can't even begin to tell you, looking back on it, if it was understandable or good or whatever. But he had a thing about the barrenness of the Macbeths
Mm-hmm.
and the fecundity or possibility or potential of the Macduffs.
Yeah.
Hence the, you know, making me pregnant as well. I had a babe in arms, I had a pregnancy belly, and I had a little one.
Oh.
And
okay.
so, yeah, and I was dressed in green. I mean, come on, you know, it's like hitting us over the head with, you know, yes, we get it.
Ding, 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 ding.
Right, you know, and I just remember the little kid was the director's son. He was pretty awful. I mean, to the point where like a lot of the other guys in the cast that were playing, you know, the different Thanes and stuff. I remember I walked in once. This is great for the recording, right? I walk in, you know, for one of the shows, and they were holding him upside down by his ankles because he had just annoyed them so much. And they were just like, you know, I'm going to eat a burrito and fart on you, you little thing, you know? And I was just like, hi, welcome, put him down, you know? And yeah, it was just, I mean, it was an interesting production. So that was my first exposure. And we, to my knowledge, didn't have anything superstitious happen. But I do remember, you know, that the superstition followed us, you know, like the director made a deal of saying that if you say the name in a theater, that purportedly bad things will happen,
Right.
you know, to the people who are attached to the production. So, you know, but I feel like that is like general actor superstition put on top of this play, because you know, a lot of times in this particular theater we were performing in, you know, we already had the usual actor traditions of the stage manager inviting the ghosts of the theater to come with a ghost light at the end, you know, before we left. There were a lot of things like that, but when people would say a name, you know, they would say the name of the play. Yeah, I do remember we had to turn around 3 times. We had to spit 3 times, but nobody. I feel like we got it wrong. You know, like when I would talk to other actors, I'm like, exactly what is the sequence, and nobody knows. They're just like, I'm spitting, I'm doing things.
Right. It's kind of a lot of undue pressure to put on the. It's not the play's fault.
Right.
And
right.
And so in a way, I feel like kind of redeeming it, because our director fell in a hole because it was an outdoor production and the park service wasn't really great about keeping up our grounds. So I don't think Macbeth pushed her into a hole. I just think it was dark because, you know, again, outdoor theater. And then if you think too about all of it is just a physically dark play. There are lots of battles, hence lots of swords and things backstage that one could run into and stab oneself with. So I really think that I think in that regard, it does get a bad rap because, you know, if you're careful and you follow your OSHA rules, I think, you know,
I was going to say, you know, like I'm trying to think back to the other, you know, times I've been involved. And I understudied Lady M for a production at CST, but it wasn't any old production. It was called Marionette Macbeth. It was a co-production with Cola I Fili from Italy, which is a very famous marionette theater. And we And so the CST actors voiced the characters
Oh, how
in the
fun.
orchestra pit, and
Yeah.
the whole stage, you know, that the usual CST courtyard space was transformed into a little puppet theater.
Mhm.
And then we transferred the production to New York to New Victory Theater for a couple weeks. And I just remember, you know, like, again, I don't think anybody had any bad feelings or anything, but the thing that really sticks in my mind out of that whole couple month process was that because it was marionettes, you know, how they just don't move with weight,
Right.
you know, so like everything from the way the witches were in the production to like even the murder of Banquo and Fleance, where you had this little, you know, marionette stabbing, you know, and the little Banquo kind of, you know, like kind of hop off and fall. And then they had like, they had the lady Macbeth at the end fall off the parapet of the little, you know, marionette
Interesting.
castle. And just to watch her, you know, because again, no weight. So she, you know, she would just kind of like leap and then float. And I was just like, you know, I realized that, I mean, this is a really interesting production. It's got all these, you know, people and all these resources and money attached to it. It's not working for me if I look at it, because it's just everything is floating.
It's too light. Like,
It's too light. You know, it's
right.
like you wanted the battles to really, you know, have that gravitas. And
Right.
there was something about it that just didn't work, even though all the voices were beautiful. And it was the most
Yeah.
strange thing I've ever been a
Interesting.
part
Like,
of.
it didn't have the physical investment.
No, that was the thing. You know, it was like, it really taught me something about how, yeah, I mean, just as actors, you know, how like we are so into the integrated whole.
Mhm.
You know, your voice, your body, things around you on a stage, every bit of it tells a story. And so if a little piece of the story is a little, you know,
Yeah.
I think it may have sucked people out for a bit. Who knows? I don't know.
That's fascinating. So let's talk, if you put on your actor director hat now.
Sure.
We've kind of delved into the supernatural elements of the play and how Shakespeare, it really was a nod to James I, because James was very much into the occult and the supernatural. And Dr. Horn tells this really great story about how when James I went over to Denmark to pick up his new bride, they sailed ships over, they came back, and there was this huge storm, and their escort was basically wiped out, and James's ship almost sank. And so when he got back to Scotland, rumor had it was there were Scottish witches and there were Danish witches, and they were like, we don't want this match to happen. And
Yeah.
so he was like, I will investigate. And so that was his start in terms of, you know, witches and the occult, and that was a very real possibility for him. And so as far as, you know, what is your stance on the supernatural elements of the play? Because I know a lot of times I've seen productions that it's really strong in the beginning, you know, it kicks off, you know, the very first line, but as the play carries on, it becomes more of a, you know, the struggle of Macbeth, and they take those elements out of the second half, and that's kind of, in my opinion, where if you do that, the play falls short. You don't have that driving energy. So what is your stance on those supernatural elements? And as a director, how have you worked through them in productions that you have worked on?
Yeah. The most recent time I did this play was in 2017, and I directed it for Oak Park Festival Theater. And yeah, I mean, the witches took me a few months to think about, because I think every other, you know, I'd been a part of either readings or radio plays or other things where it was very traditionally done. Like actually there was almost no concept to the witches. It was just like, hey, okay, we see them in 1-1, we see them over here in the 4th act. I'm not going to add to, mess with, make a comment on anything about it. The way I was looking at it, I knew about the Gunpowder Plot stuff. I knew, I'd done a lot of research on James the First and demonology, and his thoughts about necromancy and these demons and how they were at work with men. So like if we're thinking about the supernatural plane and our plane, how thin is that veil? Where does the veil get thinnest? Where do those demons lock on to humans, and how much effect do they have on humans? And the more I looked at the play, I thought it was interesting that we do, Macbeth hasn't called the witches. We start the play with them.
Right.
They say, we're going to meet him on the heath. They're gunning for him already.
Right.
And then they do. And then he, after that prophecy that sets a few things into motion and turns him kind of from an honest warrior, killing for God and country, right, into a murderer that robs him of his honor. After Duncan's murder, then after Banquo's murder and Fleance's almost murder, then he seeks them out. And I thought that was really interesting, that, they are no longer pursuing him. They planted a seed. They told him what would happen, not how, and not what would get lost or what it would cost. They just said, this is going to happen. Then he pursued them, and they show him even more, and it turns out all to be true. And then I was thinking about, okay, there's 3 of them. Interesting, kind of like the fates, right? Like when we go back to classical mythology, and the ancient Greek fates were, had functions to them. One would, I think, spin the thread, one would draw the thread to length, and one would cut it. And I really wanted to play with that idea with the witches that I had. So that's what we did. We also cast kind of gender fluid in a way. I did have 2 female identifying actors and 1 male identifying actor play these witches, but they were, I feel like the way they were costumed, the way we had thought about them, they moved as a unit. They were of a piece, but I told each of them, I think all of you have separate functions. We talked about the first, the second, and the third witch, and even how they present the text, who speaks when. And it really did, maybe not perfectly for an audience. And, I'm not sure an audience would completely register what I was doing, but I thought it was interesting that it really did line up with somebody kind of, planting something that started to spin, somebody drawing it out, and then somebody cutting it. And we did that throughout the play. And we even did it like in places where the witches shouldn't be. So like in the "Is this a dagger I see before me" speech, we had our witches were very physical, and they had a lot of acrobatic skill, and we actually had them play with the knife in front of Mackers. So he was seeing it, but they were driving this,
Right.
And it became a really interesting discussion for the audience, for the actors involved, everything, because Shakespeare's story and frame is so strong and it's so beautiful. It supported it. It was not broken by it. But people could, then say, well, how much were the witches driving what happened to Macbeth from the beginning to the very end? and how much of that was him. And I said, I think it's in the structure of the text. It's exactly what you said. We see the witches at the beginning, but we really don't. I mean, their presence and everything about their agency with him starts to diminish very quickly. He's the one that picks up that baton and runs. And it's like, I think going back to James and demonology, I think he thought the same thing. That, if you think about demons in your life, and when they are present, they come when you are vulnerable. Often, like in a weird way, when you have great joy. At the beginning of the play, Macbeth is the greatest warrior in the land. He just won a major battle. He's just been, given more glory. He is ripe for, letting ambition and pride and all the bad things get ahead of him. And then, like, when you're weak, when you're alone, when you're completely isolated, and he's killed now a few people, his wife, and he, it didn't bring them closer together. It started to rip them apart. He's alone. He needs some more demons. He goes and seeks out the witches. And I just thought that was really cool, thinking about everything. Like, James the First did not have it easy in his life. I mean, even before the Gunpowder Plot, there was the Gowrie Plot, where you just have, like, weird people kidnapping you and trying to murder you. And I mean, it's like his life was often called into questions, then certainly his monarchy was, at least on the English side of it. I just think he must have understood, like, there's a lot of times in your life where you're weak, and it's like demons can get you and to be careful.
Right. Well, and Shapiro really points out that after the plot is exposed, everyone is, the shock really is, here's this horrible thing that could have happened. How trying to imagine the unimaginable, which I think is really worse, because if the tragedy had happened, then you're dealing with a whole other set of circumstances. But it's that great what if,
right.
What would have happened? And so you have a set of individuals who are like, well, how did we not know? We had this great spy network. How did we not know? And Shapiro says it wasn't a lack of intelligence. It was a lack of imagination. Yeah. And I think that what Shakespeare does with the witches and with the supernatural in this play is he gives, life to that imagination and says, this is how it can happen. Let me help you out. And so it does become, I think, for audiences at that time, it's very cathartic, because they can process and work their way through, what could have happened on November the 5th, 1605.
Yeah. And I read somewhere that they said, if it had succeeded, what probably would have happened is, like a monarchy that was more like what Sweden and other parts of Europe had at the time, and not the balance, with the parliament that happened. And I thought that was interesting too. But like, obviously, like, man, to be a Jacobean watching this play, because there's so much texture on top of it politically that we don't get, but it's interesting to think about that if you were in the audience watching this, you're thinking about everything supernatural from what the viewpoint of whether you're a Catholic or a Protestant. You're looking at James and his reaction to absolutely frickin' everything, because even at the beginning of the play, Duncan naming Malcolm as his successor, and that implication by Shakespeare that primogeniture was normal, and it, like, apparently historically wasn't, like for the Scots, it was, the greatest warrior of the land was elected by the other Thanes, and that's usually who was made successor. So in a way, Shakespeare's kind of giving us a lot of inverted things. You know, he inverts the very verse at the beginning, from iambic pentameter to trochaic tetrameter.
Oh, yeah.
He inverts, you know, like what we think is going to happen. You know, everybody says Macbeth is awesome. He did all these awesome things. The king's like, yeah, I need to see that guy. Bring him to me. You know, everybody's gathered. You think he's going to be like, you know, I want this to be the next ruler. And he's like, well, yeah, I'm making him Thane of Cawdor, but oh yeah, I want my son to succeed me. I mean, that in a way, historically, was an inversion of what was expected to happen, and certainly would have been an inversion of what Macbeth expected to happen.
One more question for you, because I thought it was very interesting when I talked with Tyler about teaching it to ninth graders, and especially ninth graders who English is not their first language, what it's like to have them approach something that they might not necessarily know. And with Shakespeare, I always find it fascinating. I like to tell the story of my dear friend, Jim Jack. We were in grad school together, and we read every play in the canon. And most of us have either, you know, been in the plays or seen the plays. He had never seen a production of Pericles. He'd never read it until we got to school. He'd never seen a production. And I remember that was the year that Mary Zimmerman's Pericles was coming through DC. And so we all went to go see it. And I mean, again, Jim he'd never read it, never seen it. And I was like, I want to sit next to Jim tonight so that I can watch him as he watches this play. And because, you know, again, having, you know, taught this and been in productions, it's always fascinating to me how, you know, people approach the text and, you know, what are the hurdles in tackling a piece that everyone thinks that they know. So, you know, when you came at it, you know, again, it's your big summer blockbuster. so how do you overcome those hurdles, you know, in regard to a piece that everyone's like, oh, it's just Romeo and Juliet, oh, it's Midsummer. So how do you tackle that?
I think for me, I'm always excited to do those plays that we all think we know and we all live with, because I approach it, I try to approach it from, you know, square one, ground zero. I try to look at it like I've never looked at it before. And I say a try, you know, because obviously it's impossible to wipe away all that stuff, you know, that's on it, that you have on it. I mean, it's even worse if you try to approach a play where you were in a bad production of it.
Yeah.
Or somebody gave you some really bad ideas, and or you were like witness to somebody's really bad performance, and that's in your head and you're trying to get rid of it. But I think it's important anytime we're doing any play to look at it like I've never approached this before, to try from the beginning all the way to the end, not to assume a thing, you know, to try to see, okay, every step along the way, you know, so that we start to kind of take apart the things that people have put on whatever it is, you know, like, I mean, there's like two big other things along with witches that, you know, people struggle with Macbeth. A lot of times it is about the child that's lost between Lady Macbeth and Macbeth. You know, we've seen everything from them making a huge deal of this, even pre-show, you know, of that's partly why Lady Macbeth is so easy to kind of tip over into madness, and other people not deal with it at all, you know, and it's, so there's that. And then there's the porter, you know, things like a piece of the play that I think most modern audiences, most modern critics are like, this doesn't work, let's just cut it. And it is so much
time there.
Exactly, you know, and it's funny because it's like, I won't pretend that ours was wildly successful, or that people, you know, or that people would get all of the stuff that, like, obviously, again, James's audience would have been like, oh, he said that, about equivocation. Oh my God, I mean, they would get it, and they would get all those, quotes that just happened a year ago in court or in a pamphlet or something like that. They'd get it, but we don't. And, but I feel like this is the play that's written. This is something that I'm going to approach it fresh and try to honor what is here and see what happens. That's, I guess that's, like in a nutshell, the way I try to look at it.
I've always been of the mind, and I think it goes back to my training, that the audience may not always understand the words coming out of my mouth. They may not, there are no super titles. But as long as I understand it and I'm embodying that truth, some kernel of that is going to hopefully reach them. Definitely. So I think with that Porter scene, that's exactly, how it is. You honor that truth. And as long as, I get the jokes, I get the dirty puns, I would hope that as my job as, the vessel for that language would be to, hopefully some of that, rubs off on the audience.
What a genius, right? Like in all of these plays. But I think Macbeth is particularly beautifully crafted. And it's interesting to have something that, to our modern audiences, it's so packed with allusions we don't quite get. But as a function in the play, to just have a guy who's been drinking come out and talk to us, and at the end kind of be like, like the way the language is going, even if you don't get all of it, it's I'm feeling not right here. I love that. I think that's so cool that he does that.
It's a breather for the audience.
Yeah.
You need to be able to kind of take that step back, break that fourth wall a little bit, and help us out so that we can make it to the end.
Right. Because there's all these things happening that, we're witnessing it. It's easy to follow, but it's like, where is this all going? And I like that. In a comical way, he can be like, yeah, I don't know either.
I'm right there with you.
Great.
Well, Barbara, thank you so much. We're at the end of our time today, and I want to thank you for the lovely discussion, and I wish you well going into the new year.
Well, thank you. Happy New Year to you too, and thank you for inviting me to the discussion, because there's so much to talk about. Thank you.
Absolutely. All right, we are back, and thank you all for sticking with us through our two interviews there. I saw some great chatter going on in the Q&A. It looks like, Peter, we have a couple of questions here. Let's see. From Gary, is there a connection between demonology and the eventual madness of Lady Macbeth? Again, we kind of had a similar question in one of our other programs, and with this, I kind of leave it. It's a directorial choice in terms of where her madness, what the manifestation of it is from. I think it certainly would be an interesting choice to have it manifest from a demon attaching itself to her. But I also think it would be an interesting choice to, if you are really going to explore the topic of the Macbeths being just losing a child, and if you're looking at the timeline of the play, how soon she just lost a child, and perhaps it is some type of postpartum episode that she is having. Again, it's all about choices. Peter, any comments on that?
Yeah, as James Shapiro says in The Year of Lear, that James believed that there were demons alive walking the planet, and he was convinced that the heinousness of the Gunpowder Plot, and if it actually was successful, hundreds, maybe thousands of people could have been killed because of the nature of the explosion. that he believed that that plot could not have been the work of man alone.
Mhm.
That there had to be, some other agency involved in carrying out something so diabolical. With regards to Lady Macbeth's madness, I would kind of agree with Erin. I think. I mean, I think if we see her as someone who is caught up in things that we can all relate to, right? I mean, things like guilt and remorse, perhaps, and overweening ambition, as is the case with, with their husband. We humanize her a lot more, right? Rather than seeing her as, let's say, as the victim of the witch's spell or something like that. But this notion about the devil, though, is is that that she was vulnerable, and I think we talked about this the other night, that devils look for opportunities. They look for vulnerable people to exploit.
Mhm.
And that's what causes people to succumb and to commit acts of evil. And it's something that we, as I said, we'll get into next in April when we get into by help of devils, right? So.
Laura had a question, and you kind of addressed it. The Shapiro that we were referring to is James Shapiro, the author, and he has written a fantastic book. We talk about it a little more in the second interview when I talk with Tyler Madeley, but it's called The Year of Lear, and it's Shakespeare in 1606. And we're all going for copies here. But here it is, The Year of Lear. Really great exploration of, because again, 1606, year after Gunpowder Plot's in November 1605, 1606. It's a plague year in London, so we can all identify with that. But Shakespeare is penning King Lear and Macbeth at the same time. In the interview I have with Jim Horn, I mentioned that Macbeth is sometimes seen as unification propaganda for King James. King James wanted to unify Great Britain, as it were, so Scotland, England, Ireland, and there was a big unification push by James. He was going to present his unification plan to Parliament. Shapiro basically argues that King Lear is also a unification play, in that if you look at what Lear does by dividing up his kingdom and what happens in that play, that it really is a push to bring the kingdom together, because if you divide it up, bad things happen. But I highly recommend it. It's a really, really great read. And it really takes you, I'm a big proponent of understanding the point of view of an author in terms of where they were in their life and what outside current events were affecting them while they were writing their great works of literature. I find that very, very interesting. Do we think that Shakespeare knew the mindset of King James via reports, or perhaps he was drawing only from cultural notions of the time? Well, we do know historically that Shakespeare was in King James' favor. When James takes the throne, he renames Shakespeare's players the King's Men. So I don't know if Shakespeare had public audiences with King James, but he certainly knew the king's likes and dislikes, especially when they were performing plays for the king at court, just for the king and his personal guests. So Peter, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would just say that he was obviously aware of King James' interest in demonology by the virtue of the fact that we had the beginning, the witches, which most people attribute to Thomas Middleton as writing that part. So there's almost a kind of embedded homage in a way to King James' interest in the way that he uses the witches and Hecate in Macbeth.
I don't see any other questions in the chat. So I guess we'll hand it back over to you, Sarah.
All right, thank you both. That was a fantastic program. I learned a lot about Macbeth. It's one of my favorite plays. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. A recording of this program will be available on the Newberry's YouTube channel within a few days. Newberry programs remain free and open to the public thanks to the generosity of our donors. During this critical time, we need the support of our entire community. Please support the Newberry Library by making a gift today. You can do so online at newberry.org/give. We look forward to welcoming visitors back to events at the Newberry as soon as it is safe to do so. In the meantime, please join us for our next virtual program next Tuesday, March 2nd at 4 p.m., an unscripted look at script type featuring the type designer Matthew Carter in conversation with the Newberry's Jill Gage. You can register for this and other programs on our website, newberry.org/give.